So this morning we're going to look at the crucifixion of Jesus. And we are towards the end of Luke's gospel. And what we're going to see here is the first part of the crucifixion. And then next week we'll go into Palm Sunday. And then we'll end on the last part of the crucifixion on Good Friday. But we're just going to do the first part of it. It is a deeply sad text. And oftentimes when we look at this text, it's like easy to look at it as like the facts, like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and miss the emotion and the complexity that people felt within this experience. Last week we looked at Jesus and how he went before Pilate, and Pilate was this Roman governor of the area, and then he was going before Herod, who was the Jewish governor of the area of Galilee. All these religious leaders were accusing Jesus of being an insurrectionist. They accused him of starting rebellions, of wanting to overthrow Roman power by becoming the king of the Jews. They accused him of sedition and stirring people up and starting some sort of a rebellion. And this is what they're saying. And sometimes the accusations of others can convince the unconvinced, especially if they just keep coming at it again and again. Both Pilate and Herod found no guilt on Jesus, and yet they succumbed to the wishes of the crowd. And the loudest voices determined the fate of an innocent man. And an actual insurrectionist, rebellious man, a murderer named Barabbas, was released, as we looked at last week, and Pilate required Jesus to then take Barabbas's place, his punishment, in order to keep the peace throughout this one Passover year. For Pilate, he wasn't thinking like, what will this do for mankind? Pilate was thinking, how can I just get through Passover and get back home without a rebellion arising? And so he did this to keep the peace. Passover was a festival that brought thousands of Jewish people into Jerusalem every year in a celebration of remembrance of God's rescue of the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And so for generations, Israelites had been in Egypt, enslaved, born into slavery, back-breaking work day in and day out without any rest. And so when God rescued them out with Moses, if you remember that story, they were able to then worship and celebrate God. And what they decided to do within that, and God kind of instituted, was this week of gratitude, reflection of gratitude of God's faithfulness and provision for the people of Israel. And so this is what's happening in the background of the story that we'll read here in a moment. Jesus was sentenced to death by crucifixion. And I want to talk about this humiliating form of capital punishment, this torture, imperial terrorism that Rome had in place. First, crucifixion was only reserved for the most poor and for like the lower class of people. Never were a Roman citizen ever crucified. Never was a king crucified, or even the wealthy were not subject to crucifixion. They might be incarcerated, and if it was really bad, they could become beheaded, but never crucified. The crime of the poor rarely fit the punishment of crucifixion. It was used as a tool of fear. And we can see right away that those class differences that were happening back then, those biases back then, are just as alive today, right? Like our own prison systems, our prison industrial complex, are disproportionately filled with black and brown folks, showing how much racism and bias influences our own justice system. And people of color, especially poor people of color, are often prosecuted more severely compared to white, upper class, or middle class people. Racial and economic disparities impact policing. It impacts who gets pulled over, who gets arrested, and oftentimes even who gets different kinds of sentencing. Like, it doesn't take much research to figure this out. So much research has been done about the prison industrial complex. And we see it all the time, even right now, like how many wealthy and powerful people in the Epstein files, their names have been redacted. They have been ignored without any consequence. And in a form of distraction and also other things, I know it's not just like black and white all the time. There's a lot of gray here, but oftentimes it's a form of distraction, the wag the dog kind of war. We just bombed a bunch of girls in Iran and maybe might send troops. Powerful people deflect all the time, and the poor are often collateral damage. This is what history tells us time and again, and we will see it here in this story. And it makes me wonder if Jesus spent more time with the upper class or became a respected teacher in Roman symposiums, might he not have been killed in such a humiliating way, or even at all? These texts, this passage, this telling of Jesus' crucifixion can remind us of the disparities that still exist all around us and that keep us stuck in a lot of ways. Any thoughts coming up? Anything you need to say or, yeah. Yeah, AJ.
Just thinking about the criminal justice system, as a thought concept, can you have justice when a judge can set your bail no matter what crime you did at a certain amount of money?
No, isn't that wild? I was just reading about that yesterday. They can, it's on whim, depending on an opinion in some ways. I know. Yeah, Karina.
Well, it puts me right where imagining the people who were witnessing all of this, we're witnessing what's happening. Just what we do with that. The incredible, absurd frustration of what we're seeing happen.
Yeah. I mean, it feels impossible. I think part of it is still gathering together and expressing our frustration and holding the emotion and the weight of it together. Coming before the Lord, coming before prayer, supporting people like Tamara, who's a lawyer who works for these sorts of things. There's a lot of people. That's Tamara. She's a lawyer. Sorry. There's just certain people who are in the system differently that are bringing the light of Christ into those dark places, and we get to then support them in a very heavy burden that they've said yes to, that most of us have the privilege of not saying yes to. Yeah, Rabia?
I've heard it said before from someone else that was preaching that each one of us is like Barabbas. And it kind of makes me wonder what happened to him afterwards. Whether he heard that Jesus was crucified so that he could be free.
Yeah, I know.
Hope that somehow or another he went the right path eventually.
Yeah, and I think, we don't ever actually know what happened to Barabbas, but I think that's part of the, what we can do in Scripture sometimes. We can read the Scriptures and allow our imagination to go where it needs to go. Sometimes we might feel like Barabbas went back to the life he was living before and nothing changed, and depending on where we're at personally. And other times we might imagine him being a disciple and following after Jesus and supporting Paul in his ministry and all these different things. I think we get to do that sometimes. Not to say that that was fact or anything, of course. There's a quote from a book called The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, where he says, they write, "This form of imperial terrorism was always as public as possible. It was a calculated social deterrent, and as such, it had to be very, very public. Its victims were hung up as a public warning. Finally, along with other supreme penalties, such as being burned alive or eaten alive by beasts, what makes it supreme was not just the amount of suffering or even humiliation involved, but that there might be nothing left or allowed for burial." Yeah, Tamara.
It just makes me think, I think sometimes the poor are the ones that are targeted because they're the masses. And so it's how to keep the masses in control is to do this kind of public spectacle, but the masses have power as a mass. And it's the wealthy elite that are really afraid in a lot of ways. And that's why they impose this kind of thing.
Yeah. She was saying that the poor are the ones that are often targeted because they're part of the masses. And there's power in the masses, and sometimes the wealthy, there's less of them, and they are afraid that that power can get out of control. It's like a fear tactic. There were upright posts of the crosses. So how a cross is, the upright post was permanently placed outside the city gates, sometimes all around the city walls, on high and obvious places. They were put there so anybody that was walking by could see what happens if anyone might rebel against Rome or cause some sort of an uprising or push against Roman peace. And it was really for those, like the insurrectionists, the rebels, were the ones that were oftentimes crucified, almost always. Whereas, and then also runaway slaves were also crucified because they were also considered a rebel against the system. Borg and Crossan go on and they say, the victim usually carried or dragged the crossbar along with notice of the crime to be attached to one of those uprights at the place of execution. The only crucified body ever discovered in the Jewish homeland was a first-century victim whose arms were roped over the crossbar and whose ankle bones were pierced by iron nails on either side of the upright. Although he was given an honorable burial in his family tomb, other victims were often crucified low enough to the ground that not only carrion birds but scavenging dogs could reach them. And they were often left on the cross after death until little was left of their bodies, even for a possible burial. And I know this is intense. Luke 9, I wanted to read that passage to us this morning. And this is not the passage that we'll be in today, but I think it's important for us to recognize Luke 9:23. Jesus said, then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet lose or forfeit their very self? At this point in the story, when we read that part right there, in Luke's gospel, the disciples did not know he would be killed on a cross. He had told them he was going to die, but never once was he specific about how he would die. And around 10 years before the gospel was written about 40 years after Jesus was killed. So about 10 years before this was written, about 30 years after Jesus was killed on the cross, the Roman army that was led by the future emperor Titus laid siege on Jerusalem, and in the course of a few weeks, crucified 500 Jewish men a day around the city of Jerusalem. The cross wasn't a piece of jewelry people wore as a fashion statement. It represented torturous death and intimidation of an oppressive superpower. So when Jesus told his disciples they needed to take up their cross daily and follow him, I don't also think he was making light of crucifixion. Like the cross represented death and humiliation and finality in many ways. But in this example, Jesus wasn't necessarily telling them that following him would lead to a literal death. It did for many of them. That doesn't mean it happens all the time, but it does mean that there is a death and burden that comes from following Jesus. It tells us that there will be governments who will try to stop the movement of God through threats, and instead of threatening back, you carry that cross with you as you continue forth in love. So friends, the path of Jesus, this true path that Jesus puts before us, is a hard path, but I believe it is where life exists. This is exactly what I've experienced in my life. It is a hard path, but it is where true life exists. There is a death that happens. You will die to your pride when you say yes to Jesus Christ. And in that death of your pride, you will live out this sense of forgiveness. Quick to forgive, quick to be forgiven. You will put to death certainty and live out like this sense of awe and wonder, walking with God that is like way more expansive, full of grace than we could have ever possibly imagined. Like you will die to this perfected image that you might have for yourself, or trying to keep people to understand what you mean, but yet in that death you live in freedom from those bonds that oftentimes plague us. This death of carrying the cross comes new life and new hope as you take up your cross and follow Jesus. Okay, on that, let's go into today's passage. We'll read it through and then talk about what comes up, what kind of curiosities you might have, and then I'll keep going with what I feel God has given us today. So we'll be in Luke 23 in verses 26 to 43. It'll be up on the screen, and then there's Bibles throughout the room if you would like to read it in a Bible. As the soldiers led Jesus away from Pilate and Herod, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, or Golgotha, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his left and the other on his right. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. And they said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the King of Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him, which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." May the Lord add a blessing to this reading. Thanks be to God. Any curiosities or thoughts, perspectives? Yeah, Kim?
I think it's easy for us to do a lot of self-imposed punishment with a lot of guilt and shame, and then it's easy to forget how merciful and graceful Jesus is. And it's very powerful, but shame can often take that over.
Thanks for that, Kim. Yeah, Hollis.
I've been thinking a lot about the atonement theology versus God's grace kind of thing we talk about a lot. And I think for the people of the past, the horrible judgment of life was kind of taken for granted because life was so brutal. And that, I don't think that God as the righteous judge is a wrong way to look at it. I just don't think it's complete. Because the cross isn't just judgment and atonement. It's also us doing everything we can to God to make him suffer, and him still with his arms open saying, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing."
Yeah, it's like almost too much to bear.
It's too much for us to bear.
Yeah,
It's not too much for him to bear.
yeah. It's good. Thanks, Hollis. I think of Simon who carried that cross. We talked about bearing our cross, like Jesus invites us to do that. And I wonder why Simon carried the cross. Most people wouldn't be given another person to carry it. That was part of the punishment. And yet I'm wondering if it was because Jesus was so beaten that he could not walk, that he literally carried the cross. Simon, this guy that maybe shows up in the rest of Acts. There is somebody named Simon that shows up in Acts, but we have no clue if it's the same Simon. But that was a very common name during that time. But he literally carried the cross, following Jesus. Jesus set the pace all the way to his death, all the way to his crucifixion. And Simon was there with him. And I think about these two criminals that are on either side of Jesus. Borg and Crossan, they say about that, they say Jesus is executed as a rebel against Rome between two other rebels against Rome, putting him in that same category, the same place of assumption. So I wonder about those two other rebels. Like, were they disciples of Barabbas? When Jesus took Barabbas's place, was he then the leader in that moment, according to the people watching in some ways? Like, was Barabbas the ringleader? Was he the one that convinced the others to join his cause and take down the enemy? And did they come into the gang with, like, good intentions, hoping to help their fellow countrymen who were being terrorized by Roman imperial power? Did they have family members who were so poor they didn't know where their next meal would come from? Did Roman taxation steal their family land and then force their younger siblings into slavery to pay off debts? Many people today are incarcerated because of their own desperation through poverty. Poverty causes people to do things they would have never imagined themselves to do. And I wonder about those two guys. Yeah, Pearl.
Taxation just reminded me that Neil Lane we're reading about things leading up to the Revolutionary War, and
Oh, yeah.
that was unfair.
Yeah, the things leading up to the Revolutionary War she's been learning about, and how a lot of that had to do with unfair taxation. And people do rise up when it feels like things are so oppressive, especially when they're starving to death, right? Yeah, Lydia.
I wonder if the demanding of Barabbas was almost like trying to force Jesus' hand to be the Messiah that they wanted. Because that is what the Jewish leadership of that time wanted in the Messiah.
Right.
It wasn't insurrectionists, and like maybe they were just like one final like, Rome's gonna kill you if you don't act like this guy, if you don't look like this guy, you're like, this is your one chance to be what we want you to be.
Yeah.
And that's never been, like, I really have been sitting with like the idea of the wrath of God, and I really believe that it's never intended for humans to experience. And Christ just chose to continue silently and with humility.
That's so interesting. I've never thought of that, Lydia. Like the sense that maybe, if I'm understanding you correctly, like maybe the people were hoping Barabbas could be the type of Messiah that they want, the one that would like rise up against Rome. And Judas the Galilean, who was somebody who came of, how many years, Mike, how many years was Judas the Galilean? 70 years before Jesus? Yeah, and he caused like this huge uprising, and people were like, maybe he's the Messiah, and he was killed. Mike knows everything. If you have any questions about the Bible, he retains all the information that you'll ever need to know. It's brilliant. A quote from, am I in the spot here? Yeah. A quote from Amy Jo Levine and Ben Witherington. Amy Jo Levine is a womanist Jewish theologian. She writes, crucifixion is being tortured to death by being stripped naked and hung from a cross to die, finally and agonizingly, of asphyxiation, as air can no longer get into one's lungs. Is this a death justly deserved? Not only does this scene inform us that justice can miscarry and that the state does put the innocent to death, it also raises the question, what constitutes a just punishment? It was the forgotten who were often crucified. It was the ones who wouldn't be remembered. It was the ones who didn't matter much and were probably better off without them anyway. At least that was the dominant narrative. And it was one of these men who did not matter, who would probably be forgotten, that Jesus said, I will remember you. I won't forget you. You matter. Even in these last moments, you matter. He said that to one of the criminals next to him. Even in these last moments of Jesus' own life, as he had some of his own precious breath left within him, he chokes out of his lungs to let this man know that he was saved. Like even in Jesus' dying, he saves the lost. And this is who Jesus is and was and is to come. Jesus is the one who directly goes into places of suffering to alleviate suffering. In John's gospel, we read that Jesus even spoke out this precious breath out over John and his mother, where he's like, this is now your son. John will now be your caretaker. Like, I want to alleviate your suffering in this moment too, reminding the people there and all of us here that we all matter, that we're not alone, that we're not forgotten. Hollis, what were you going to say?
I'm struck by the faith of the thief to say to a man who's even more beaten down and bloody than he is in that situation, remember me when you come into your kingdom. To see through the world and to see the divine in that situation.
Yeah, so powerful. I think about the part where they're walking to the cross and Jesus turns to these women and he says, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. And it makes me think, like, who do we weep for? Do we weep for ourselves? Do we weep for our children who will experience the disasters of climate change? Do we weep for our children who are the first generation who are less smart than the generation before them? Do we weep for our children who might be drafted into a war that doesn't make sense? Do we weep for our children who lived through COVID and now have these lasting effects on their mental health and their motivation? For our children who wealthy, powerful people have consumed their bodies? For our children who aren't interested in their faith or in Jesus or in the church? Do we weep for them? Do we weep for our children who experience racism and class bias and ICE thugs terrorizing them and their friends? For our children who have to practice active shooter training in their schools, who experience hunger in their homes, who won't be able to afford to buy a house someday? Do we weep for our children? Weep not for Jesus, he says, but weep for those who Jesus came for. In Luke 9, Jesus talks about how, or the text says that Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. It's like this pivot point in the Gospel of Luke. So all up to 9 is about like Jesus' ministry, getting the disciples going, healing people. And then from 9 on, it's like he is focused on Jerusalem. He's focused on what God is calling him to do, which is an impossible ask. But it says he resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. And it would have reminded the readers of the text of Isaiah 50, verse 7, where it says, because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. Even in the most humiliating way, Jesus knew he would not be put to shame. He set his face like flint, resolutely, purposefully, intentionally, toward Jerusalem, toward suffering. Purposefully toward suffering. In Luke 19, 41 to 42, there we go. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, Jesus wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. It is hidden from your eyes. Wept over Jerusalem, his face like flint towards suffering, whether it was to help alleviate the suffering of the man crucified next to him with his words, or through helping his mom see that she was included into this beloved family of disciples, or whether it was the woman who was caught in the act of adultery, or the man suffering from leprosy, or those with chronic illness. Jesus didn't turn away from hardship and suffering, but went willingly there. And instead of rescuing himself or running away, he set his face like flint, resolved and intentional towards it all, and asks us to do the same as his followers. Will you take up your cross and follow his example of love? Setting your face like flint towards the betterment of your family. Setting your face like flint towards the betterment of your community. Setting your face like flint towards the betterment of your mental health. Setting your face like flint towards the spirituality that you've been invited into, this great community of faith. Are you focused like Christ was focused? Historian and theologian Justo Gonzalez, he writes, it is to this path, opposition to suffering, evil, and exploitation, that Jesus calls his disciples in inviting them to take up their cross and follow him. It is certainly a path of self-denial, but not of meaningless, resigned, or passive suffering. It is a path of opposition to all that is evil, even though that evil may appear respectable and even legal. It is a path of solidarity with all those who suffer under the present order of the world, of suffering with them. One might even say that it is a path of taking up not only the cross of Jesus, but also all the crosses that people are made to bear by the existing order, in this case, the Roman Empire, and thus relieving them of their suffering and oppression. A couple years ago, I spent a few days at a Jesuit retreat in Los Altos, and I was with a few other pastors. We broke into these small groups during that time, and we were asked to share our stories with each other from birth until now, and then to pray with each other. And so we had 15 minutes to share our callings and our difficulties and our mentors that we've had and our family of origin, and also how do we see God moving in our lives. And we shared them all together with each other. And I shared about the poverty I experienced in many ways when I was a child. I shared about anxiety and infertility and adoption and other insurmountable things that some of you know about in my life, or where God has carried me gently and kindly through. And one pastor prayed over me. I've shared this before, but one pastor prayed over me. He goes, "Lord, we read stories in the Bible that are far-fetched, like Daniel in the lion's den. But then we hear stories like Bethany's and we think, maybe those stories aren't so far-fetched." and I rolled my eyes while he was praying. But I took it to heart. And as I was driving home, I was reflecting on that, reflecting on that prayer. And it's true in many ways. There have been a lot of lions in my life. I've been surrounded at times by situations that could tear me to pieces. And God's like, yeah, I see them. They are so scary. They can't kill you. You're getting bumped around and bruised, absolutely. But you're safe. I've shut their mouths. They can't kill you. You might be surrounded by lions, but keep trusting me because they can't hurt you. And you felt this too, haven't you? Yeah. You felt surrounded by lions in your life, and you've wondered if you will ever escape or if you will be destroyed. And here you are. Here you are. Think about the lions that you've faced. All those scary, violent, threatening lions. Having to drop out of college, going through a divorce, broken friendships, kids on drugs, your own addiction and chronic illness. The lions of shame and insecurity and self-harm, where you didn't know if you would make it through. You didn't know, and yet you have been protected more times than you can count, and God is asking you to trust him in this season too. And while it doesn't make sense, and I can't explain it to you or figure it out necessarily, here you are. Here you are. And some of those lions are truly evil. At the cross, Jesus confronted all evil realities that underwrite all human activity, powers and principalities that are anti-God and anti-good. Jesus confronted that evil, the evil one himself that influences and convinces men and people to take what they want when they want it. And in his innocence, Jesus' death confronts all the biases of our failing and greedy prison and justice systems and forces us Christians to do something about it, working through our own hidden racism and prejudice that lives within so many of us. think most of us have been really unprepared for the enormity of evil that we've seen in the last few months. The complexity of people that you thought you deeply respected and admired, to find out that they've done good, but they also have done such harm. We just found out this week about Cesar Chavez, who was raping girls. He did really good work. We celebrate the good work he did and the movement that started because of him, and we abhor the evil he did as well. How many of you have heard of youth pastors or pastors sleeping with 15-year-old girls? That's challenging. Or like the president being accused of sexual assault and mentioned thousands of times in the Epstein files. Or the missionary who defrauded old ladies of their retirement funds, promising that they'll have great rewards in heaven. Or Bill Gates, who has given millions to good charities and is also a sexual deviant. Or that nice put-together family that brings in foster kids, but has actually been neglecting and ostracizing them behind closed doors. Or the healthcare worker that has been belittling and physically harming their dementia patient. I mean, each of these people that I mentioned are still the beloved child of God, but they still need to be held accountable for the suffering they've caused. And we live in this tension that there is more evil in this world than any of us were really prepared for. And I think that this is one of the reasons, the main reason, Jesus went to the cross. Brian McLaren writes in We Make the Road by Walking, he says, since the beginning, Jesus has taught that the non-violent will inherit the earth. Violence cannot defeat violence. Hate cannot defeat hate. Fear cannot defeat fear. Domination cannot defeat domination. God's way is different. God must achieve victory through defeat, glory through shame, strength through weakness, leadership through servanthood, and life through death. Jesus set his face like flint towards suffering, and with his precious breath choking out from his suffocating lungs, he spoke out, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And it's this kind of forgiveness that we have all received from a God who empowers us to continue forth in love, even when it seems like evil is winning. Because the battle is not over, friends. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities that underwrite all that evil in the world. And we are to continue to fight against those things in the power of the Holy Spirit. Victory comes through surrender into love. And until we see victory, those lions cannot kill you. God has shut their mouths, and God will never leave your side. So Lord, as we go into Holy Week this next week, as we enter towards this journey to your cross, towards your suffering, as we are experiencing it in ourselves and in the world around us, may you remind us that you are loving us all along, that you've never left us, you will never leave us or forsake us, that you've empowered us to do good, to bring forth your truth into this world, to fight against evil and darkness within us and around us. And we are not alone in this fight. Lord, whatever needs to be kept in people's hearts and minds this week, I pray that you'll make it so, and whatever needs to leave because it's no longer helpful, I pray that you'll make that so as well. We pray all these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.